So, it may have taken a bit longer than expected, but Prime Minister Justin Trudeau tendered his resignation, pending the election of a new Liberal leader. No surprise there, that was pretty much predicted. Then Trudeau prorogued Parliament. Again, no surprise. That's a common tactic by political parties to kind of put things on pause when there's a bit of a kerfuffle. While there was initially a long list of people who indicated they might run to lead the Liberal Party, they started to fall by the wayside once it looked like Mark Carney was putting his name on the ballot. Again, not much of a surprise. What was a surprise was the official statement on January 13th by Jaime Battiste, the Liberal MP for Sydney-Victoria, that he was going to explore the possibility of running to head the Liberal Party. I don't think anybody was expecting that. I know I wasn't. So naturally, I had to contact him to see if he was brave enough to enter the hardcore world of political podcasting and talk to me about his announcement. My name is Pam Palmater, and I'm the host of this podcast, The Warrior Brief, where we talk everything politics and we get down to the nitty-gritty, always based on facts, though. We don't have any conspiracy theories or fake news on this podcast. So for those of you who don't know him, here's a little bit of information. Jaime Battiste is a Mi'kmaq band member from Potlotek First Nation, but he's lived most of his life in Eskasoni. He was first elected as the Member of Parliament for Sydney-Victoria in 2019, and he's the first Mi'kmaq to be elected to Parliament. He's a fluent Mi'kmaq speaker and was also the first parliamentarian to speak Mi'kmaq in the House of Commons. He's served on various parliamentary committees, including, of course, the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. Prior to that kind of federal politics, he was also a university professor, the treaty education lead for Mi'kmaq, and the Assembly of First Nations regional chief. In 2005, he won the National Aboriginal Health Organization Award for National Aboriginal Role Model in Canada. In 2018, he got the Sovereign Medal Award for volunteers, and he holds a law degree from Dalhousie University, and he got his undergrad degree at Cape Breton in Mi'kmaq Studies. Interestingly enough, he's also a musician, a recording artist, and founder of the Mi'kmaq Music Showcase that features and promotes songs in the Mi'kmaq language. We had an extended conversation. I asked him lots of questions, some easy questions, some open questions, and maybe a few hard questions. Over the next little while, I will share clips from our interview and really want your feedback. What do you think about all this? What do you think about his answers? What does this mean potentially for the Liberal Party? What if he doesn't go ahead with the leadership? Will there be workings behind the scenes, maybe to have a different political outcome in the spring? Well, you're going to have to listen to the Warrior Brief podcast if you want to know more. I'm your host, Pam Palmater. Let's get right into it. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, Jaime. I mean, it's not every day that someone from our nation, the Mi'kmaq Nation, even considers taking on such a huge job. Why on earth would you even consider this in this whole climate? Like, why politics?
Great, Pam. Thank you for having me today. We've known each other for a while, and from our exciting days of discussing Mi'kmaq citizenship, and why politics. There's a lot of reasons why I put my name in the hat for this race, but overall in politics as general. I think you know who my family is. Dr. Marie Battiste, educator. My father, Sagej Henderson. I've watched them for their whole lives, fight against systemic racism, fight for human rights. And I've seen my mom do so through education, which is an important thing. It's inspired me. Seen my father be a part of every one of the Mi'kmaq major cases in litigation that went forward. In terms of the Simon case, in terms of the Marshall case, a lot of that research was based on the initial research that my father did over the years during his time as a legal advisor for the Mi'kmaq Grand Council. I was a protester before I was a politician. I remember the Idle No More days. I was out there actively protesting and being an advocate and using my voice in a way that was the best way possible. And I think those are really two important things that Indigenous people across this country have really been able to do. We've used litigation, we've used education, we've used advocacy through protesting, mostly peaceful. We've done what we could in those things, and those are really important things. But what we really haven't tried well is mobilizing politically. We're not playing the political game. We're not getting involved in those circles where people are making those decisions. The first time I ever thought that I could really support a party was during the Kelowna Accord, when I was there as member of the Assembly of First Nations National Youth Council. I saw Paul Martin gather all the premiers in Canada for a First Ministers meeting to talk about our issues, to talk about that $5.1 billion. And, it was an important momentous occasion. You had people celebrating that night. It was like, yes, finally, they're listening to us, not just a government, but all of the premiers are hearing about our issues as Indigenous people. And so we didn't get that across the finish line. I'm not going to blame any political party for its failure, but it didn't get to where it needed to be. And we went through 11 years of Harper, and we remembered how that was like. And it was a time when I was a protester, and when Prime Minister Trudeau was elected, he started. We saw 10 Indigenous people as part of his caucus originally, and saying, one of them was a good friend of mine, Don Rusnak, who I went to law school with. I started going to Ottawa, having conversations with them, and just saw, that there was a need for more Indigenous voices in there. And if we had more Indigenous voices, that we could get more things for our people. And so we really never, as Indigenous people across Canada, have mobilized and created that strength politically as we did then. And so the other major thing that he did as Prime Minister, and the party did, that made me think that I could be a member of Parliament, was that they said that there was going to be no more costs for membership for the Liberal Party of Canada. And so when my predecessor, Mark Eiking, stepped down, I had a few people call me asking me whether I would consider it internally, who were MPs, and so, because I never thought that was a possibility. But I knew that I could sign up many Mi'kmaq, because I'd walk into houses and I'd say, "Oh, Jaime, what are you doing here?" I said, I'd say, "I'm campaigning," in the Mi'kmaq language. And they all laughed at me because they thought I was campaigning for chief and council, which wasn't for another 2 years. And I said, "No, I'm trying something else." And they were like, "Oh, that could work." And so I got enough Mi'kmaq people excited, enough Mi'kmaq people in the communities, enough people in Cape Breton excited about the possibility of a first ever Mi'kmaq candidate. And I was able to win on the first ballot. And, I've been able to win 2 elections since then. I've been the Indigenous caucus chair for the Liberal Party for the last 5 years, which means every single caucus meeting where we meet, I get 3 minutes, just like every other caucus chair, to talk to the cabinet and talk to the Prime Minister directly about issues facing Indigenous people. And over that time, we've seen our investments go from Indigenous people from 15 billion to 33 billion. And so I've really think that I've been an effective voice in really advocating for the things that matter to Indigenous people as that voice. I know that I'm one of the more respected members of our caucus for the way I deliver my message and the way I, try to touch people's heart instead of making them feel guilty or anger. I try to tell them what the situation is really like, and try to, really share a genuine idea of why we should be thinking that Indigenous reconciliation is important in that caucus. And to be quite honest, it was never my intention to run for Prime Minister. I was urged to do this. I was really hoping that some strong names like Sean Fraser would step up. He was someone who I always thought that would be a great person to do this. When I realized that there wasn't going to be a voice from the Atlantic, I said, you know, I'm hearing from the chiefs. They want me to do this. None of my really close allies and friends who I believe in are running. And I saw us. I was a bit concerned about the direction of the country. I saw us moving back on key things and key reconciliation points, and I saw us taking that $48 billion off the table. And I said, you know, I could spend the next 6 weeks apologizing and feeling anger and sorrow, or I could use the voice that I have, the platform that I have as a sitting member of parliament, and say, I'm going to do everything I can to get that money back on the table, and so that to make sure that any leaders moving forward are not moving backwards on reconciliation, but moving forward and continuing the promises. Because it's all, you know, I know that there's a trade war coming up. I know there's a lot of people have anxiety about what that's going to mean to us financially. I just don't believe that Indigenous investments should be the first things pulled. I know that there's a lot of things that people pull, but I just don't believe we can move backwards on reconciliation in this country.
What would you say to the people on social media saying, this is the end of the Mi'kmaq Nation. You can't be a part of federal politics without hurting our rights and our self-determination? Like, do you think that being a part of federal politics hurts us or helps us?
I think it helps. I think we have to use every arrow that we can shoot. You know, my father once told me, you know, at the same time when they were fighting Canada in courts in the 80s and 90s, they were also making the push internationally in the United Nations. And it was because of not only looking at what they could do domestically, but looking at what they could do internationally, that they were able to, you know, start the format of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which my father was one of the authors of the initial draft of that. And, you know, in my time in politics, I was happy to see that I was able to push for that to be law in Canada in Bill C-15. So I think that we can't limit ourselves as Indigenous people to just, I respect completely those people who want the autonomy and say we're not part of Canada, and I totally respect where they're coming from on that. But the reality is, if we can't show that we care about who the next leader is, if we can't show that we're going to get involved in politics, then when it comes time for those politicians to make decisions around what they're going to prioritize, they're going to prioritize the people who are showing up and voting, and that's democracy. And you know, I totally respect if people don't feel that they've been a part of the narrative in Canada, but I think that's changed in the past 5 years since I've been there. And I think that what we have now is an opportunity to mobilize like we've never mobilized before. Like Indigenous youth over the age of 14 can now vote for who the next prime minister is going to be. Instead of waiting for the next, you know, leader of, you know, formal election where you have to be 18 and over, what we can do now is mobilize all that Indigenous youth that are out there and say, if you're 14, if you care about reconciliation, if you care about the environment, if you care about social justice and human rights, you have an opportunity now, not in the future, but absolutely right now. If by signing up for my team, by signing up for this race, you can decide. And there's a lot of, there's 21 ridings in Canada where in 2015, Indigenous communities flipped and decided who was going to be the governing party. I got that stat from former National Chief Perry Bellegarde, who said, I mean, if First Nations youth realized the power that they had, you know, this would be a different country. And it can be a different country. They need to get involved, they need to get excited, and they need to sign up.
Hey friends, Pam Palmater here. I hope you're enjoying this episode of the Warrior Brief podcast. My mission is to offer critical, fact-based analysis of political, legal, and social issues that are facing Canadians from an Indigenous perspective. I'm not a member of, nor do I work for or campaign for any political party at any level of government. And I do that because I want to be able to consider what everybody has to say on a wide variety of perspectives And remember, the Warrior Brief Substack and podcast is only possible with your subscriptions and support. And I think you'll find an inspiring group of family, friends, allies, and supporters, as well as fellow advocates, activists, and analysts here at the Warrior Brief. Thanks so much for your support, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. Since you've been elected, you have chaired the Liberal Indigenous Caucus. What else have you done specifically as an MP? Have you held any posts? Have you tried to support any new policy or legislation that would have a direct impact on us?
So in my first sitting from when I was elected in 2019, I was fortunate enough to be able to have a private members bill move forward on environmental labeling. And I believed that if Canadians had a real choice, they would choose what's better for our environment. And there's a lot of labeling out there that isn't accurate. They call it greenwashing. They say that they're good for the environment, but they're bought and paid for labels. But I thought that if Canada, if you think about what we see on our labels of food, like the cholesterol, like the fats, all that kind of stuff, it was my dream to see that done with products that show the environmental labeling, showing the greenhouse gas impacts, showed water consumed, energy consumed, and all of these things. And I put together what they called Motion M35 that asked for a study to see how we could do this. That was one of the first things I was able to do that I was proud of, that showed my commitment to the environment. In that time, I was on the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee, and one of the studies that I was most proud of was our work around Bill C-15, which was the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act. I really pushed hard for that because my father was one of the initial drafters of that document, and I remember my neighbor and my father, the late Grand Captain Alec Denny, going to the United Nations asking for this. And if people don't understand what UNDRIP does for us, we know that there's treaty rights. But there's also these what we call inherent or aboriginal rights that, what nations were asking us was, what does it mean to be able to live free from discrimination? And what started off was Indigenous people have the right to self-determination, moved on to an expansion of all of these things: free, prior, informed consent, protection of languages, protection of citizenship, who we get to choose our own people, Article 33, all of these important articles that say, that gives definition to the support for inherent rights. And that's what UNDRIP really does, and says this is law in Canada now, and we were able to push that forward. In terms of pure numbers, sometimes I look down and see our federal budgets, and it's a lot of money. But when I saw that from 2019, when I was elected, to now, if you look at the Indigenous investments, it's gone from 15 billion to 33 billion, and largely that's because of the advocacy within our caucus of Indigenous caucus, my interventions at caucus, asking them to prioritize things that are important to us: Indigenous health, Indigenous policing, housing, of course, is very important, making sure that we had money to fix the problem around water. These are things that I've advocated for. And, in your discussions with the Minister of Finance, you have a list of about 20 things usually that you want her to look at. And she said, well, Jaime, can you prioritize the top 3 or 4 that you want in here? And that's a lot of different things, but I've been successful in advocating for that. The other legislations I think that are important: the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. We also have an independent Truth and Reconciliation committee that's going to oversee these things. One of my favorite documents that I created was kind of a cheat sheet for the TRC calls to action for our government, and because I wanted to take all of the 94 calls to action and put them on a 2-pager and saying, here's what this section says, here's which ministry is involved here, and I need to know what you're doing. And so I could send minister this, say, like, these things are in your ministry, what are you doing about them? And just kind of creating that and just showing people for every day in National Truth and Reconciliation. And people will say, well, they've only committed or completed this many. And I think that's disingenuous, because so many of the calls to actions calling for continuous funding, and you can't just check a box and say done just because you funded it one year. It requires continuous funding moving into the future. And so those are a few short things. I could talk a lot more, but I know that you, I don't want to, yeah, I want to keep them short and sweet, but I'm not good at being short or sweet, I
No,
suppose.
no. Which is great. One of the things that the Liberal Party has been looking at is the Indigenous procurement strategy to make sure that any funds that are set aside for actual, real Indigenous peoples goes to Indigenous peoples. And another thing that they have been working on is this second generation cutoff, like consultations to once and for all get rid of this disappearing Indian formula. Can you talk about like why those two things are so important and what could happen to those things if a different party is elected?
Well, I was having a conversation in northern New Brunswick, one of the counselors out there, and she was talking to me about the problem of the non-stated paternity and second generation cutoff, that many of the children that are being born into their community aren't registered under the Indian Act because of the second generation cutoff. And I started thinking about, well, how do we address this? Like, what could we possibly do? And, from a long ride, 8 hours from the northern New Brunswick, I think it was Eel Ground, to Cape Breton, I started making some calls and talking to some people. And I said, why don't we just put that back in the hands of the communities? I believe that United Nations Declaration of the Rights of the Indigenous People, Article 33, says nations and communities should be able to decide who their people are. Right now, the federal government does it based on a formula that they created, and I think that formula is discriminatory. I think it's long past its due date, and I've been really pushing inside, having conversations with ministers, having conversations with the internal departments on how we can do that. A lot of the things they said, well, Jaime, you have a really good idea on this, but we have to do the proper consultation and the things. But in the heart of it, I believe that it should not be the federal government who's determining for communities who is and who isn't a member. I think that should be up to the nation, if it's possible, or that community. And I've suggested ways in which we can get rid of the second generation cutoff, and to the point where now we've gone through the initial realm of consultation, and now just in December we put out the proposals. And the proposals from First Nation, it could be done by the regions like Atlantic region or the Manitoba, and give us their suggestions on how we do that. Like I have my thoughts on how we can do that, but it's important to hear the feedback from the communities. But there is a commitment to doing this, and I will say that if I'm Prime Minister, and this, and I know it's a long shot, I will put it back in the hands of the communities and not the federal government, who isn't a member of our community, because we can't allow, within 10 20 years that there will be in some communities, no more indigenous, like status Indians born in those communities because of this.
It's just incredible to think of. And for anyone who is listening or watching and doesn't really know the mechanics of parliament or government, can you just let us know what happens if the Liberal Party comes back on, I think it's March 24th, and the opposition parties have a vote of non-confidence, and then a spring election is called? What happens to all of these initiatives, consultations, legislation that's in the works?
Well, they die. Basically, all of the good work that's been done and all of the things that we're moving forward on. I did a lot of work on C-61, the First Nations clean water legislation, and that I got that through. I got it into committee by unanimous consent, by requesting unanimous consent. The Conservatives said no to it. 10 minutes later, they changed their mind and did the same thing that I tried to do. This time, when I was so collaborative in terms of trying to get all, like the Bloc Québécois, the Conservatives, and the NDP on side and say, let's find legislation that we all can agree on, so we can get it to the House, get it to Senate, and make sure that this happens before we rise in December, because we don't know what could happen. But of course, the Conservatives specifically, Andrew Scheer said that, they weren't going to allow this. We worked so collaboratively with them to ensure all of their concerns were met, and they just said, no, we're not going to support that. And so that, we're looking at a lot of things that are going to be pulled off the table for First Nations if we're going to an election, if we have, potentially with the polls the way they are, a conservative government. My hope is that the leaders of the NDP see a candidate who wants to get things done that they agree with around First Nations clean water, around the $48 billion settlement, around the disability benefit, about completing dental, a national food program, and say, it's too important for us at this junction to go into an election without finishing these key pieces. My hope is that a new leader will give them the ability to have that discussion and say, what, we don't need to collapse the government now and go into an election. We can work with this new leader and this new team to move forward on these key areas that we all can agree on as Canadians. And sometimes it takes reaching out to the premiers as well. And I've known Premier Wab Kinew for more than almost 20 years, I'd say, and being able to have conversations with him, and saying, what can we agree on? Can you put some pressure on your federal cousins to do some things? The Premier of British Columbia, David Eby, I went to law school with him. We're friends, been able to have conversations on these things. And so I've talked to premiers across the country, and I do have hope that March isn't the end of all of this good policy, that we can move forward, but it's going to require the support of one party. And usually the NDP has been that party that says, okay, we may not agree with you on everything, but we agree with you on these key principles, and we think they're important enough to move forward. And it's my sincere hope that through this election, that they're going to see that there are people in the Liberal camp that have these values and these principles that they can agree with enough. And to be quite honest, I have a lot of respect for some of my colleagues in the NDP MPs, and that I've had really good conversations with them over the years about what's important. And I think that we can find common ground to at least keep us going for another few months, so we can get these really key pieces of legislation over the finish line.
Oh my gosh. And that huge long-term reform in child and family services, like that settlement, to be able to move that forward, like, to me, that's just so critical. So I want to come back to you. You are engaged in this exploratory process I guess it's to put out feelers and to see if there's support for you being a leader. Is that kind of what the exploratory process is all about?
When I was urged to do this, I told him, last weekend, I made more than 60 calls to First Nations leaders across this country and said, do you want me to do this? Would you support me if I do this? And many of them said, absolutely, you'll do it. But you need to tell the media you're going to do this. You need to get it out there. And so I told them, I'm going to take this on. I'm going to do all the work necessary, but there are some significant hurdles here. Raising $350,000 when I just started on Monday is something that's going to be a great challenge. But unless First Nations communities and Atlantic communities get excited about my campaign, the first hurdle is $50,000 on Thursday. I think I'm close to 20 grand on this and the weekend. And so, I think that Monday and Tuesday will be a really telling thing. But what people have told me was, if you run, people will support you. Our community, our nation will be behind you. And so we have a few days to demonstrate that. And I'll keep fighting. I'll keep using my voice as long as I can. But if I can't, finish these hurdles, then I'll say that I gave it my best shot and fought until the end. But I also need people to get excited about this. I need people to sign up from across Canada. If I can't show that thousands of First Nations, Atlantic Canadians, people who care about the environment are excited about my campaign, it won't be as successful. So what I've said on Monday is I'm trying. I'm going to do everything I can. And if I get the support, I'll keep going and I'll keep fighting till the end. but these are some significant challenges considering the fact that I was never thinking about this, never really put a team together. I wasn't trying to, for months trying to do this. And so where I'm coming in at this very late moment, but I was urged to do this. And I said, okay, I'll fight for you if you'll help me. And so that's what the message has been. I'm trying to fight for us. I'm trying to do what I can. I've got the platform to do it as a person who's been elected twice, and middle bench is not the front or the back, but I'm just going to continue fighting until for our people and for us as long as I can, and see what if I can get the support and the excitement from people to continue fighting in this race.
Anyone who is in the public light, anyone who is in the media, in fact, anybody who's on social media knows that as soon as you accomplish something, or as soon as you say, hey, I think I'm going to throw my name in the hat, especially in the political arena, then out come the darts, so to speak, and everything that you've ever done. And I mean, I think it's a form of accountability that people say, okay, what's your voting record? What are things that you worked on? What are things that we didn't agree with or that we did agree with? But then there's also the personal things that people want to address. So you've made some comments in the past that would be considered misogynist or racist. What do you say about the fact that I think it was 13 or 14 years ago, you said some of those things? How do you hold yourself to account when you say something that's racist or sexist?
Mm-hmm. Well, they were awful comments. Let's be honest, and I apologize for it immediately, but I don't want to be defined by my past. You can't delete your past. All you can do is learn from it. So I remember that those difficult times when this first broke 5 years ago, calling people across the Canada, and one of them, luckily, I was able to call was Premier Canoe, and he said, Jaime, he was an MLA at that point, but he said, you have an opportunity to show them who you really are. And I always thank them for that, because it said, you know what, my future is more important than my past, and what I do moving forward is more important. And so I've done everything I can to show that I've be an ally for Indigenous women. When I was in my first 2 years, I worked on an important project with the late great Miles Goodwin that brought light to murdered and missing Indigenous women. I had the Native Women's Association of Canada's president as part of this. What we were really trying to do is showcase what was going on out there. And if you get a chance on YouTube, there's a video called Darling, Where Are You? Where Are You? By Miles Goodwin, that was filmed in Eskasoni with Mi'kmaq. I'm actually in the video, but you get all kinds of. It tells a great story. But one of the interesting things about that was, as we were doing the shooting, after that, I got a call from then Carolyn Bennett and said, Jaime, that project that you've been advocating for in Nova Scotia, it was the Native Women's Resilience Center. It's going to be one of the successful projects for us. And one of the best calls I ever made was to the president of the Native Women's Association of Nova Scotia, and saying, this dream that you've had for 20 years about, having this center, we're going to be able to fund that as a government. And that making that announcement was one of the more prouder moments of my life, and just showing that, not only that I was trying to bring awareness, but I was actually delivering on funding in the millions for folks. And so, as I've done my best to show that I could be a champion for Indigenous women out there, I continue to try. You can't run away from your past, but you can only learn from it and move forward and say, here's who I've been. And I think that I've been able to advocate for Indigenous women and celebrate Indigenous women and really and promote them. We have some strong Indigenous women in the NDP caucus, and that I would never take anything away from what they've been able to achieve.
Well, and I think that's the difference. So when something someone has said or done in the past happens, the natural reaction from most politicians is to ignore it or deny it or do the, oh, I'm sorry you were offended. You like that's your issue where you're saying, yeah, those were all awful things and there's the word apology, but then there's the actions. If you just went on and didn't advocate for Indigenous people or Indigenous women, then we would say, like empty words. And so I wish more people would be upfront and say, yeah, like what I said sucked, and there's no excuse for it. And here's what I'm going to do to try to make up for it. And Premier Wab Kinew is a prime example of someone who has said and done things in the past that he's regretted. And he's done everything he can to like not only make amends, but to show, well, here's who I am now. So I just appreciate that you address it. Most people, when I ask things, they're like, yeah, no, no, can't talk about those things.
It's important in the Mi'kmaq language. There's this term called abiksiktuan, which means forgiveness. But the Grand Captain of the Mi'kmaq Nation always says, before there's forgiveness in abiksiktuan, there has to be aniapsin. You have to make amends for what you did. It's reparations. And I still think that I'm on that journey of aniapsin with Indigenous women in Canada, and for those comments. But I'm going to keep trying, and that's why I do what I'm doing, and that's why things around the second generation cutoff and non-stated paternity I continue to fight for, because these are things that are important, and I realize that all I can do is see what I can do moving forward and show and demonstrate that I can be an ally, and that's what I'm trying to do.
So, Jaime, you're engaged in this exploratory process. That means you might go ahead, you might not go ahead, depending on what you find out during this process. Let's just say you chose not to go ahead, or you went ahead, but you weren't elected as the head of the Liberals. What do you envision for the Liberals moving forward? What kinds of things should they be working on in terms of, big files, whether it's Indigenous or environment or social supports?
When people urged me to do this, and I said I would take it on, I knew that it was a big challenge. I knew that this system was not set up for a Mi'kmaq from the res to be entering this race. But I said I'd fight. And I said, there always has to be the first to try. And before there was a Premier Wab Kinew, there had to be an Elijah Harper. Before there was a President Barack Obama, there had to be a Jesse Jackson. There always has to be that first person to try, even if those steps are just meant to pave the way for future generations. I'm going to be a member of the Liberal Party. I'm going to be in there fighting for us. I'm going to be in there talking about the things that matter, like the environment, reconciliation, human rights. I will be there to continue to advocate as an MP, as a potential leadership candidate. These are the things that I believe in, and I hope that people over the next week to 2 weeks sign up for the Liberal Party. You have until January 27th to show that you care about the future of this country, that you want to be able to decide who the next prime minister is. And you don't have to be a current Liberal to do that. You could sign up, and it takes 2 minutes, doesn't cost anything. You don't have to be 14. If we can get enough people excited, if we get thousands of Indigenous people, thousands of Atlantic Canadians excited, thousands of environmentalists excited about the possibility of my leadership, then we have a chance to have a lot of influence. But I can only have influence on the party and on the leadership if I can demonstrate that people believe in what I believe in. And that's where I ask, the reason why I'm doing all this social media and that I'm out there is because I need people to get excited about this race and that believe that they can make a difference. And they can, but they just have to sign up and trust that I'm going to be able to make the calls I need to make to raise the money that I need to raise to continue on in this race. And, a lot of people have said, how long will you be in the race? I will be in the race until, as a former boxer, you fight till the bell rings. When they tell me, Jaime, you haven't raised enough money, you haven't got what you need, I'll say, okay, I tried my best. But someday, at some point in our future, we will have an Indigenous prime minister. At some point in our future, this is going to be a dream. And if I can lay that foundation, and maybe 10 years down the line, maybe I'm a little bit older and wiser, and that the people might think of me at that way, or maybe it's someone else, and I'll be able to say, this is the process that you have to do to try to be prime minister of this country. This is the work that you have to be ready to do. This is the stuff you have to do. For now, I'm going to try to create excitement to make it happen now, knowing full well that I'm a long shot. But, I've always told people, if you can't be the most wealthy or the most powerful, have the most interesting story. And what's a more interesting story than a Mi'kmaq kid, a band member from Potlotek, who was raised in Eskasoni, spent some time in Saskatoon, who overcame all of the odds, overcame all of the negative things that people threw at him, and became a leader of this country. Wouldn't it show how great our country is and how resilient our people is that we can do this? And so that's the dream. And I know it's a long shot, but if you can't inspire people to dream and take these long shots, what did I get into this for? There's the Indigenous angle, but I think that we're really in environment is a big piece of this.
Yeah.
We're going through climate crisis now in northern communities, in coastal communities. In Cape Breton, we've had floods, we've had fires, we've had roads wash away, we've had Hurricane Fiona, we've had the huge snowfall, 160 centimeters. Like, we're feeling the impacts of the climate crisis now in many places. We can't go backwards, and there's no technology out there that currently exists that's going to save our future. So at the end of the day, Nedugalimk is something I believe as a Mi'kmaq person. We're connected with our environment. We are not owners of it. We are part of it. And as Canadians, as a human species, we have to realize that we are responsible right now for the future generations. And if we don't make the necessary steps now for the environment, that we're giving our children an unlivable future. And I've always said, at the end of this journey in politics, I want to be able to look at my son and say, when I was given the chance, when I had some power, when I had some influence, every decision I made was to give you a better future. And not to just try to get reelected. And so I think that's the difference between politicians and leaders. And so, I endeavor to be a leader in this. And I think that environment has to be the biggest priority for us moving forward. And when I hear people saying, they're going to make pollution free again, that scares me. 5 years of Conservatives, 4 years of Conservatives government, what would that mean to our future of our planet? And especially with a Trump and Poilievre both preaching that we don't have to care about environmental sustainability. What is that going to mean for our future? And so that's what really concerns me. And so if I don't use my platform, if I don't use my voice at this time in our history, and I got my sister to do this medallion for me on Earth Day, and just like, this is, sometimes I'll wear this in the house, and when we're doing votes and people are talking about axing the carbon tax, I'll lift this up and, like, this is the reason why I'm voting why I'm voting, and this is the reason I got into politics, because there's no option B for our planet Earth, and so we got to do everything we can.
And I think all of the parties need to really think about their priorities. The fact that the world has set itself up as oil and gas dependent, and everything has to revolve around oil and gas and pipelines and all of the conflict and environmental destruction that has. I'm hoping that your influence could help the Liberals move forward on things like that. So alternative energy, green energy, renewables, training a whole new science and technology around how do we have sustainable energy. And I can only assume that's what you would be really trying to, work through the Liberal Party, and basically work with all the parties to say, we need to do better than just the stereotypical oil, gas, pipelines, and that's our future. There's got to be something else.
Yeah. And, I have one thing I've been able to do over the past 5 years. I think I have a great relationship with Elizabeth May. We have sometimes we have some really good conversations. We have an immense amount of respect for each other, and you know, I share a lot of the same views on the environment, and so we need an option in this race who isn't saying get rid of the price on pollution. I need to be that person who talks about this and reconciliation, the environment, human rights. This is what I'm going to continue to talk about. So I appreciate you giving me this time to have a conversation with you. All I ask is that you know, you share the link, that if people believe what the things that I'm saying, sign up. We need thousands. We don't need hundreds. We need thousands of people to show that they care about the environment, they care about reconciliation, they care about human rights. And so,
Well, Alan, and thank you for taking the time.